The Old West was a geography where violence and needless bloodshed were the order of the day. From the lawless frontier cities to the open ranges, it was all war for survival, land, and tussle for power. This is the culmination of the most brutal and deadly wars that have left an indelible mark in the history of the Old West. The gunfights, massive massacre of Indians by foreign settlers, and civil wars. We take a look at 10 of the most brutal battles in the history of the Old West. Join us as we revisit the darkest chapters in the history of America, where only the brave, strong, and powerful survive. Top of our list is the Battle of the Little Bighorn took place on June 25, 1876, in Montana Territory, along the Little Bighorn River. A group of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors faced off against federal forces under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Ever since gold was discovered on Native American grounds, tensions have been building between the two tribes. Following some tribes' failure to meet the government deadline to relocate to reservations, the U.S. Custer and his 7th Cavalry were among the soldiers sent by the Army to meet them. Custer's soldiers were outnumbered and soon overpowered in what came to be known as Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn, because he was ignorant of the sheer number of Indians fighting under Sitting Bull's leadership. Custer's 600 soldiers arrived in the Little Bighorn Valley at about midday on June 25th. News of the approaching raid swiftly circulated among the Native Americans, while Crazy Horse led a huge group of warriors to confront the intruders head-on. The elder Sitting Bull gathered the warriors and ensured the protection of the women and children. Custer made frantic attempts to get his troops back together, but they were easily outnumbered. Up to 3,000 Native Americans assaulted Custer and about 200 men in his regiment. In less than an hour, Custer and every soldier were dead. Custer's last stand, popularly known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, was the most decisive Native American victory and the worst U.S. The lengthy Plains Indian War ended with an Army loss. Many white Americans were incensed by Custer and his men's death, which reinforced their perception of Indians as untamed and ruthless. In the meantime, the U.S. authorities worked harder to bring the tribes under control. Nearly all Sioux and Cheyenne people would be living on reservations in 5 years. Colonel John Chivington's Colorado soldiers killed a peaceful band of Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho Native Americans at Sand Creek, Colorado, on November 29th, 1864. The protracted struggle for dominance of eastern Colorado's Great Plains was at the heart of the reasons for the Sand Creek Massacre. Ownership of the territory north of the Arkansas River to the Nebraska border, including the Cheyenne and Arapaho, was assured by the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. But by the end of the decade, waves of European-American miners swept through the area in pursuit of gold in Colorado's Rocky Mountains, severely taxing the dry plains resources. Tensions between recent immigrants and Native Americans were on the rise by 1861. A delegation of Cheyenne people, led by Chief Black Kettle and a few Arapaho chiefs, agreed to a new settlement with the federal government on February 8th of that year. The Native Americans obtained an annuity payment and a 600-square-mile reservation in exchange for giving up the majority of their territory. The group reasoned that their ability to negotiate would be compromised by ongoing violence. Black Kettle and his fellow delegates represented only a portion of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in the decentralized world of the tribes. The Treaty of Fort Wise was a new accord that was rejected by many. The tribes were unable to be sustained by the new reserve or the federal money. A new wave of tensions and intermittent bloodshed between Native Americans and white people emerged during the Civil War. Governor of the Colorado Territory, John Evans, invited friendly Indians to camp close to military forts in June 1864 to drive out stubborn Native Americans. The Indians were given food and shelter in exchange for their cooperation. In addition, He issued an appeal for volunteers to cover the military vacuum created by the majority of Colorado's regular army soldiers being dispatched to other fronts in the Civil War. Evans met with Black Kettle and a few other leaders in August 1864 in an attempt to build a new peace, and everyone went away happy. After moving his tribe to Fort Lyon, Colorado, Black Kettle was urged to hunt in the vicinity of Sand Creek by the commanding commander. Chivington sent his forces to the plains in what can only be described as a betrayal, and on November 29th, they assaulted the gullible Native Americans, dispersing men, women, and children, and pursuing them. The fight's one-sidedness is reflected in the casualties. 9 of Chivington's soldiers perished, while 148 of Black Kettle's supporters, more than half of them who were women and children, were murdered. The Colorado volunteers reappeared, slaughtered the injured, disfigured the corpses, and set the settlement on fire. When the details of the slaughter came to light, the troops' crimes were first applauded, but then denounced. Chivington abandoned his promising political career and left the military. After surviving, Black Kettle carried on his peace initiatives. His supporters agreed to a new Indian Territory reserve in 1865. Around 250 Native Americans, primarily Minnican Jew people of the Lakota Sioux Nation, were killed by the U.S. soldiers near Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, on December 29, 1890, during the Wounded Knee Massacre. The majority of the Native Americans involved in the incident were sick, unarmed women and children, despite the U.S. administration characterizing it as a battle. Rising hostilities over the ghost dance, a well-liked peaceful activity among the Plains Indian tribes that was perceived as a warlike exercise, between Army commanders, agents of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and white settlers, led to the thief slaughter. Valentine McGillicuddy, a surgeon and previously skilled Indian agent, tried to convey to the government that the ghost dance was a religious movement and not a call to violence, but his advice was disregarded. The Dawes Act of 1887 had divided the Great Sioux Reservation to provide land to white settlers, and a Sioux military response was anticipated. Acting Indian Agent James McLaughlin called for the deployment of additional troops to South Dakota, where these soldiers were already on high alert for an insurrection. At Wounded Knee Creek, early on December 29, 1890, as the soldiers were disarming the Sioux, a rifle went off, and the soldiers around the Sioux camp started fire. It is estimated that between 250 and 300 Sioux were butchered, while 25 U.S. soldiers were killed, mostly by friendly fire. Mayor George A. Forsyth and a volunteer army of 50 frontiersmen are the targets of a surprise attack by a sizable Cheyenne and Sioux band early on September 17, 1868, in Colorado. After retreating to a tiny sandbar in the Arickaree River, which came to be known as Beecher's Island, Forsyth and his men were able to repel 3 combined attacks by the Indians. Many of the assailants, including the war commander Roman Nose, were killed or wounded by Forsyth's volunteers thanks to the quick firepower of their 7-shot Spencer rifles. However, as dusk arrived and the battle ceased for a while, Forsyth discovered he had 22 men killed or injured and surmised that a force of 600 Native Americans encircled the survivors. If the white settlers couldn't find a way to aid, they would surely be wiped off. Jack Stilwell and Pierre Trudeau, 2 guys who had offered to try to get away, vanished into thin air. For 5 more days, the conflict continued. Before the Native American soldiers eventually departed, Forsyth's effective fighting force was down to 10 men. With few carts and horses, Forsyth was miles from assistance. But he knew that many of his injured would soon perish if they did not get assistance. Thankfully, on September 25th, a field ambulance and medical supplies were brought to their aid by the 10th Cavalry, one of the 2 African-American groups in the Army known as the Buffalo Soldiers. By some miracle, Stilwell and Trudeau had survived the Cheyenne and Sioux and were able to deliver aid. Numerous men's lives were spared because of the Buffalo Soldiers' prompt arrival. On August 1st, 1867, 3 miles from Fort C.F. Smith, in Montana Territory, the Hayfield Fight took place. It was a Red Cloud's war battle involving 21 American soldiers, 9 civilian hay-cutting crew members, and several hundred Indian warriors, principally Arapaho and Cheyenne, with a small number of Lakota Sioux. The Bozeman Trail, which passed through Powder River Country, which was home to the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, and Crow tribes, was being used, but the Indians were resisting. One of the 3 forts built in 1866 to guard emigrants on the Bozeman Trail, which connected Fort Laramie, Wyoming, with the Montana goldfields, was Fort C.F. Smith. A sizable contingent of Indians started to approach the troops and villagers laboring in a hayfield close to the fort on the morning of August 1st, 1867. As over 700 warriors advanced, 30 soldiers and civilians sought safety in a corral. The Indians, who were protected by a low log corral barrier, were taken aback by the speed with which the soldier-civilian force, equipped with recently acquired Springfield Model 1866 rifles that could fire breech, could react. Following that, the Indians withdrew from the attack, giving the defenders more time to strengthen their defenses by excavating trenches and lining wagon boxes with soil to deflect bullets. That afternoon, the Indians renewed their assault, but the troops had solidified their position. The Indians withdrew their offensive after 6 hours of fighting off the soldiers and civilians. Out of the combatants and bystanders, 3 perished and 4 sustained injuries. Although the exact number of Indian deaths is unknown, estimates range from 8 to 23 massacres. Later, numerous troops chastised Lieutenant Colonel Luther Bradley for his official report's downplaying of the conflict and for taking too long to get aid to the men stranded in the hayfield. This conflict has not gotten as much attention from historians as the wagon box fight, which happened the next day outside Fort Phil Kearny, Wyoming, and was identical in circumstances and losses. Both times, it is thought that the troops' defensive stances and new weapons were essential to preventing the greater forces of the Powder River warriors from overwhelming. Red Cloud's war came to an end with the wagon box fight, but the Indians kept raiding passengers, troops, telegraph wires, and the Union Pacific Railway, which was still being built. The Bozeman Trail and the forts were shut down by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, thereby ending the conflict. George Crook was sent to the Southwest in June 1871 to assist in putting an end to fighting between settlers and Yavapai and Apache tribal members in the central Arizona Territory. To find the tribal people and bring them back to the reservations, he launched the Tonto Basin Campaign. There were more than 20 conflicts throughout the operation, including a successful attack on a Yavapai camp in December 1872 that resulted in the deaths of 76 indigenous at the Battle of Salt River Canyon. A group of Tonto Apaches ambushed and murdered 3 white men on March 11, 1873. Crook's forces followed the assailants to Turret Peak in central Arizona, a Yavapai stronghold. Turret Peak was scaled at midnight on March 27, 1873, by a troop of soldiers and Apache scouts led by Captain George M. Randall. The troops ambushed and startled a rancheria close to the mountain's peak, waiting until daylight to do so. Many of the indigenous people simply leaped off the mountainside, dying below, since they were so shocked and terrified. Some fought back, dying or giving up after a brief period of resistance. As a result, 57 Indians perished, and several more were injured or taken prisoner. Regretfully, a few citizens who had been unintentionally killed by rolling rocks or the encircling fire were discovered within the cave after the combat had halted. The Yavapai and Apache tribes saw a dismal outcome from the battle at Turret Peak. At Camp Verde, several of the hostiles turned themselves into crook on April 6th, 2 weeks after the combat. The Medal of Honor was eventually given to a number of the men who participated in the battle at Turret Peak. On November 25, 1864, in the area of Adobe Walls, the ruins of William Bent's abandoned adobe fort along the Canadian River in what is now Hutchinson County, there was the first fight of Adobe Walls. On the Great Plains, the fight was one of the biggest conflicts between white settlers and American Indians. The American Indians saw the Wagoners as trespassers who slaughtered their wildlife. Therefore, it came about as a result of General James H. Carleton, commander of the military troops in New Mexico, his intention to stop Comanche and Kiowa attacks on Santa Fe wagon train. Commanding the 1st Cavalry of the New Mexico Volunteers, Colonel Christopher Carson received orders to organize an expedition against the Comanches and Kiowa winter encampment, which was said to be located somewhere on the southern edge of the fair Canadian border. With 14 officers, 321 enlisted men, and 75 Ute and Jicarilla Apache scouts and combatants he had recruited from Lucian Maxwell's property in Cimarron, New Mexico, he landed at Fort Bascom on November 10. 2 days later, the column marched down the Canadian into the Texas Panhandle, armed with 2 mountain howitzers, under later George H. Pettus' command, 27 wagons, an ambulance, and 45 days' supplies. Carson was headed to Adobe Walls, where Bent had employed him over 20 years prior. Following a snowstorm-related postponement, the column slept for the night of November 24 at Mule Springs, some 30 miles west of Adobe Walls, in what is now Moore County. Recently, a sizable band of American Indians with several horses and livestock had come into and surrounding Adobe Walls, according to reports from 2 of Carson's scouts. All cavalry regiments and the 2 howitzers were ordered to advance immediately by Carson, with Litter Cullen, Francisco P. Abreu's infantry, followed later with the supply train. Carson stopped to wait for the sunrise after traveling 15 kilometers. The guys were made more uncomfortable by the late-night frost and the prohibition on fires and loud conversation. 176 huts had also been demolished, in addition to a large number of buffalo robes, winter supplies, and Dohazen's army ambulance wagon. A young Mexican volunteer in Carson's mission is said to have taken 1 Comanche scalp. The group dissolved after safely returning to Fort Bascom. Though the former mountain man was unable to deliver a fatal blow, General Carleton praised Carson's withdrawal in the face of overwhelming odds as an extraordinary military achievement. Carson is widely seen as having won the battle decisively. Carson later said that at least 1,000 fully prepared troops would be needed if Adobe Walls were to be reoccupied. In 1877, George Pettus, who'd been the expedition's artillery officer, wrote the first-hand account of the combat outside of Carson's military letter. 9 to 20 males, including Black Kettle, and 18 to 40 women and children, were among the estimated dead, although some estimates put the number of deaths as high as 103. River Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer launches an early dawn attack on a group of peaceful Cheyenne living with Chief Black Kettle, neglecting to locate the settlement or conduct any reconnaissance. Custer was removed from rank and command for a year by the government after he was found guilty in a military court earlier that year of desertion and abuse of soldiers. General Philip Sheridan brought Custer back to command a campaign against the Cheyenne Indians, who had been conducting attacks in Kansas and Oklahoma over the summer. 10 months after Custer had been sentenced to that penalty in September 1868, Custer had a bad reputation and was not well liked by the 7th Cavalry soldiers. But he was a strong fighter, and Sheridan was unhappy with his other leaders' inability to locate and attack the enemy. Sheridan concluded that since the Indians would be in their permanent encampment, a campaign over the winter may be more successful. Custer discovered a sizable Cheyenne settlement on November 26th. It was situated not far from the Ouachita River, outside of what is now Cheyenne, Oklahoma. Custer made no effort to determine which Cheyenne tribe was present in the hamlet, or to conduct even a quick survey of the area. Custer would have learned that they were a peaceful people living on reserve land, where their safety had been assured by the commander of Fort Cobb, if he had taken that action. The tribe was trying to avoid confrontation, as seen by the white flag that was flying from one of the principal homes. After encircling the hamlet the previous evening, Custer ordered the regimental band to play Gary Owen at first light, indicating that 4 columns of soldiers should advance into the village. In the first 15 minutes of the battle, many Cheyenne were slain due to their lack of numbers and surprise, but a few warriors were able to flee to the trees and retaliate. The soldiers slaughtered 103 Cheyenne in a matter of hours, including the calm Black Kettle and several women and children, leaving the hamlet completely devastated. The Battle of the Ouachita, often regarded as the first significant American victory in the Indian Wars, helped rebuild Custer's reputation and convinced many Cheyenne to go to the reservation. Custer's propensity to charge untested Native American encampments, however, would ultimately prove fatal during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of Custer's Wagon Train, also known as the Battle of Red Buttes, Wyoming, took place on July 26, 1865, between U.S. troops and the Sioux and Cheyenne people. Following the successful chase of the troops back inside the garrison at Plattbridge Station, the Cheyenne and Sioux shifted their attention to the wagon train that was drawing near. On July 25, 1865, the 5 supply wagons departed Sweetwater Station and made camp at Willow Springs, which was roughly halfway to Plattbridge, under the protection of Sergeant Amos J. Custard and 25 Kansas cavalrymen. Custard turned down the invitation to accompany Lieutenant Henry C. Bretney and Captain A. Smith Leib, who were stopping at his camp that evening, on their route to Plattbridge with their detachments. The Army supply train started traveling eastward along the Telegraph Road close to the North Platte River early the following morning. After passing Red Buttes, Custard came across an Ohio cavalry unit that advised him to turn back because thousands of Indians were besieging the post up ahead. However, the sergeant declined. "We don't stop here, sir. We don't stop here, sir. Despite all the redskins on this side of hell, we are heading to Plattbridge," would turn out to be a fatal mistake. 5 men were dispatched to scout ahead when they heard gunshots as the wagons progressed. They were attacked as soon as they departed, while 3 soldiers managed to reach the Plattbridge Station and slay the Cheyenne warrior Left Hand, the brother of renowned war chieftain Roman Nose. 2 of the men were slain. Custard and his surviving soldiers were surrounded by Indians in the meanwhile. After giving the command to corral the wagons, the sergeant opened fire on the invading Indians. For 4 hours, Custard and his men held out, despite being vastly outnumbered. But in the end, every one of them would perish. The Indians suffered an estimated loss of 12 fatalities and 18 injured. Just the 3 scouts who reached the Plattbridge Station out of the 26 men lived. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls took place on June 27, 1874, when a group of roughly 700 Plains Indians, mostly Cheyennes, Comanches, and Kiowas, led by Quanah Parker and Issa Tai, attacked a buffalo hunters' camp that had been established. Spring in what is now Hutchinson County, roughly a mile from the adobe ruins known as Adobe Walls. When the Indians charged at daybreak, most of the hunters at the camp were up fixing a broken ridgepole. Gathered in Jim Hanrahan's saloon, Charlie Myers and Leonard Storr, and Charlie Rath and Wright Storr, the defenders, 28 men and 1 woman, repulsed the initial onslaught with just 2 men lost. Latter charges, which went on until about noon, claimed the lives of another guy, and another man was inadvertently murdered by his gunshot. Izatai, a medicine man, had encouraged the Indians to battle, and for 4 or 5 days they conducted a fruitless siege without launching any further attacks. A cluster of 15 or 20 Cheyennes materialized on a high mesa overlooking the post on the second day. Their presence precipitated William Billy Dixon's renowned shooting, in which Dixon shot an Indian 7/8 of a mile distant from his horse while within the stockade. After word spread among the local hunters about the attack on adobe walls, more than 100 men had arrived at the location by the end of the 5th day. The Indians had retreated, giving up the struggle, and a rescue party had arrived. This battle is significant because it set up the Red River War of 1874 to 1875, which was the catalyst for the Southern Plains Indians' eventual removal to reservations in modern-day Oklahoma. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in our next video.